Hi everyone, and welcome to this video today. I suspect you're not going to enjoy this one because it's going to be far more of you working than it is of me talking. What we're going to be doing today is applying your knowledge to a scenario question around the law of negligence. So this is your scenario, and what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is actually have a go at answering the question. My first tip is always read the question first, so that you know when you're looking at the scenario what sort of things it is that you're looking for. Sometimes it can give you the clues as to what's important and what's not important, and it cuts down on the amount of time that you've got. The other thing that I need to say is these videos are set up for the new EDUCAS law specification in terms of the style of the questions and the number of marks which are available. You can use them for AQA and OCR and the old specifications if you're doing a resit in the summer of 2018. However, you just need to be aware of that because the timings and the number of marks are going to be different. So don't get used to doing it this way if you're not using those exam boards. So just use this as a learning tool, but you'll need to adjust it to your spec. Okay? So you have been warned. So the scenario I'm going to ask you to look at is around Susan, and you're going to advise Susan on her potential liability for Tim's injuries. And this is the scenario. So Susan is age 16. She's recently started a care course at college and was on her first work experience placement looking after Tim, who was aged 2. Tim demanded to do some painting, and in order to keep him quiet, Susan agreed. She found some old pots of paint in the shed and gave Tim some cotton wool to spread the paint on sheets of paper. Some of the pots had small labels marked danger, toxic, which Susan did not read. Tim suffered poisoning as a result of handling the paint, but fortunately recovered after a short spell in hospital. A solicitor has estimated that Tim's damages might be around £3,000 in a simple personal injury claim. And once again, the question is, advise Susan on her potential liability for Tim's injuries. So, whichever exam board you're on, you can give it a go, but you'll need to adjust these instructions to your spec. So, EDUCAS people, what I need you to do is you have 12 minutes, I know that's no time at all, to answer the question. So you need to split your time between duty, breach of duty causes damage, and you've got 12 minutes. So pause the video now, time yourself strictly 12 minutes. If you can't do it in that time, you need to cut it down, and I will see you in 12 minutes time with your answer. So I'm assuming that you've paused and that you've given it a go, and you're not just going to watch the rest of this video to find out what the answer is, because that's not terribly helpful. So this is the way that I would go about answering this. So what I'm going to ask you to do before we go on to the answer is I want you to self-assess yourself. There is no point in doing this if you're not going to compare what you have done to what I'm suggesting. And in terms of valuable learning experiences, assessing yourself and changing and adjusting your answer is probably the most valuable learning tool that you have got. In terms of revision techniques, in terms of improving your grades, this is the best thing that you can be doing for yourself. Make sure that you genuinely look at your answer and all of its merits. There's no point in being too positive, and there's equally no point in being too negative. So try and be realistic. So first of all, we have to have a look at whether Susan owes Tim a duty of care. So the first point that you've got to discuss is the neighbour principle. So EDUCAS people, you don't have a lot of time to talk about this, and you're just going to have to say, neighbour principle outlined in Donahue and Stevenson, Tim is foreseeably affected by Susan's acts or omissions because she is his babysitter. You then need to go straight into Kapara and Diekman, three-part test with the appropriate conclusion that there is a duty owed. So it's foreseeable that someone in Tim's position would suffer a loss as a result of handling the toxic materials, and just the case name Kenton Griffiths in brackets, if you possibly can. They're in close proximity in time and space. They're in the same place at the same time, as in Boyle, Hill and Young. And it's fair, just and reasonable, as there's no public policy reason on the grounds of extending categories of liability or protecting public services, as in Hill and the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. Susan isn't rescuing Tim, she's not a public servant, and therefore it is fair, just and reasonable to owe a duty, therefore duty owed. Moving on, and yeah, I know that was really quick, but you've got to get used to it. So we've got to talk about how Susan breached her duty towards Tim. So the reasonable man and the effect of the age on the standard expected, as in Blythe and Birmingham Waterworks. So the reason she is a reasonable babysitter, and that's who we would compare her to, but you would need to address the lack of experience issue. Whichever conclusion you come to is up to you, but you do need to talk about the fact that she's an inexperienced babysitter. And you would probably consider her to be a learner, as in Nettleship and Weston. But as the case of Nettleship says, standards may rise, but they may not fall. So she, as a babysitter, is expected to do what any other reasonable babysitter would do, i.e. read the label on the paint and not give the baby the toxic material. So then you need to have a think about your 4 risk factors. The vulnerability of the claimant. Because he's 2 years old, he is more vulnerable, so he is more at risk. The size of the risk. There is the known danger from the container warnings. Practicality of taking precautions. The precautions were easy. Check the paint was suitable for children, so the standard of care isn't reduced. And the benefit of taking that risk. There was no benefit for allowing Tim to use that particular paint, and just shutting up the crying baby was not a reasonable excuse for giving him whatever he wanted. So moving along, how Susan's breach of duty of care has caused the damage to Tim. So first of all, we look at factual causation, as in Barnett. But for Susan giving him the paint, he wouldn't have been harmed. The legal cause, meaning the main cause, with no novus actus interveniens. I address legal causation and remoteness as 2 separate things, but you can run these things together depending on how your teacher instructs you to do it. Remoteness of damage, you're only liable for things which are reasonably foreseeable, as in Wagonmount. It was foreseeable that he could be hurt by the toxic paint. And you don't have to predict the exact way that the injury will occur or the extent of the damage. Didn't have to predict that he would be poisoned. It could have been a reaction to his skin, he could have got it in his eyes. All you need to identify is, and it's really obvious, the breach of Susan's duty by giving him the paint would cause some sort of damage, which it did. And the thin skull rule, so this is very relevant to us here. In scenarios where it's less relevant because you don't have a vulnerable victim, you can just mention this if you have a chance. Even just a sort of signpost at the end can be enough to get you the marks. There is no thin skull because the claimant is not vulnerable, full stop, if it wasn't relevant. But because Tim is 2 years old, he is vulnerable. So we have to look at the case of Smith and Leach Brain and say you have to take your victim as you find them. So Susan still is responsible for the full range of injuries, and it doesn't matter that an adult wouldn't have put the paint in their mouth, etc. Also worth a mention, if you can get it in there, that she didn't give him the approach. If she'd given him a paintbrush, it may not have ended up in his mouth. And actually, it's not just the paint that makes this situation worse, it's the way that he put on the paint. But I would see that as an enhancement rather than the main focus of the question. So that, ladies and gents, is how you're going to go about doing this. If you go back and watch this video again, you will see that the application stuff was in red. What you can think about doing is, everything that wasn't in red, all of the text in black, can be standard for a explain whether so-and-so owes a duty to thingy. So now you've attempted both explaining the law and applying. I want you to have a look back, watch the video again, and compare your answer to my answer properly. and see what areas for improvement you can identify around duty of care, breach of duty causes damage. And you need to work out what you're going to do with them. And your homework, and yes, this is a YouTube video giving you a piece of homework, is whichever area you've identified as the most pressing issue, and I suspect at this stage it will be time management. Make sure that you come up with a plan and that you actually deal with this. And finally, I'd like you to have a look at this scenario with Maria. The question: advise Better Buy on their potential liability for Maria's injuries and losses. Again, it's another 9 marker. Look back on the way that you answered the previous one to think about how you're going to do this one. So Maria, who's a pilot on a very high income, has been shopping at Better Buy on a very icy day. She was returning to her car and she slipped and lost control of her trolley. Maria suffered a broken hip and spent a long time in hospital, and the trolley also caused £6,000 of damage to her car. She's been advised that the total claim for her injuries will be in the region of £70,000. When the accident was investigated, it was discovered that the place where Maria had slipped was particularly dangerous because there'd been an oil spill the previous day, which Better Buy had not properly cleaned up. So go on, give it a go. Advise Better Buy on their potential liability for Maria's injuries and losses. You got 12 minutes. Best of luck.